Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born in 4 BCE and died in 65 CE. He was advisor to the Emperor Nero for the first few years of Nero's reign. This was a time before Nero had degenerated, and actually his rulership with Seneca's tutelage was pretty good. Things got a little bit more heated after that, though, and Seneca and Nero had a series of pretty bad fallings out. Fortunately, a large number of Seneca's philosophical treatises and letters have come down to us, as well as some of his plays. It's clear that Seneca was a very talented writer and a very talented rhetorician, as well as a good philosopher, which means that his works are, I think, a lot of fun to read. He was forced to commit suicide for his supposed complicity in a plot to kill the Emperor Nero. He was likely innocent, but the suicide that he had to undertake didn't go so well. He tried to cut his veins, but the blood flow wasn't enough to kill him, and so even though he was trying to emulate Socrates in his death, it didn't go nearly as smoothly. Finally, given the number of similarities between Seneca and some ideas in early Christianity, there actually arose a tradition in later antiquity that Seneca and St. Paul were pen pals. Now, these stories are almost certainly false, but it shows that the early Christians saw something morally worthy in what Seneca was saying. And I think that's part of the reason why it is that so many of his treatises have survived and in such good condition. Now, I'm particularly excited to talk about his work, The De Ira, on anger today, because it's just such a wonderful and rich text, and I'll be reading more than I normally would, but hopefully that will encourage you to read the whole text yourself. Again, I find it really inspiring and really wonderfully written, so it should be worth your time. In good philosophical fashion, it seems that Seneca started off his treatise by trying to define anger. And though the treatise as a whole is in pretty good shape, unfortunately the section is actually pretty fragmentary, so we're not entirely sure what Seneca's final definition of anger was. However, he reports a number of definitions that are from the Stoic school, and so I think it's safe to assume that he adopted their definition as well. So according to Posidonius, the Stoic philosopher, anger is the desire to take vengeance for a wrong, or alternatively, the desire to punish the person by whom you reckon you are unjustly harmed. Now, there are two important aspects to each of these definitions. In the first place, anger is a desire that is prompted by wrongdoing or injustice. In that sense, it's a fundamentally moral emotion. Anger doesn't just respond to any kind of activity, it responds to what we think are transgressions of the norms that we're supposed to be living by. You can see why this is important by contrasting it with a case where you're harmed, but not unjustly. So say you recognize that you've broken some rule and that you deserve punishment. You don't get angry in that case. In fact, you think it might even be good that you suffer the punishment having broken the rules. So you don't get angry if you think that the harm done against you is justified or is in accordance with the norms that we all agreed to. The second component of the definition is that anger aims at striking back. In other definitions, this is put in terms of vengeance or in terms of revenge. The ancients really emphasized that revenge is a core part of the definition of anger. Lots of contemporary commentators have criticized the Stoic account, which is also the Aristotelian account and was a very common account well into the early modern period, for including revenge in part of the definition of anger. And we should think carefully about why it is that they've included it as part of their definition. Of course, some people think that the definition should just be updated, such that it doesn't have the revenge component. But as you might suspect, I think we actually need to think harder about this. I think the ancients are onto something, and we're really missing a core part of what anger is if we don't include this component. One strategy, which has recently been defended by Martha Nussbaum, is to point out that often we confuse anger for nearby emotions. In particular, she thinks that we often confuse anger, which includes a component of revenge, with indignation, which is very similar to anger insofar as it's also prompted by injustice, but doesn't necessarily have this revenge component. So that's one way forward. We can define anger as having a revenge component, and say that when people sometimes talk about being angry at the injustices they see in society, really they mean something more like indignation. I think another strategy that's really promising is to fixate less on the word revenge, which for us has some pretty specific connotations, and look more at what the idea is that the Stoics are getting at. And I think the idea that they're getting at is payback, that anger somehow prompts us to lash out or seek punishment or impose some kind of cost on the person who wronged us. And this, I think, really gets to the heart of what we know from our own experiences of anger. Anger prompts us to lash out at others, and we don't always do so in a very discriminatory way. Sometimes anger takes whichever target it can when it really overwhelms us. Moreover, think about the fact that we often wish ill upon those people that we're angry at. One instance that comes to mind is the fact that people were surprisingly gleeful when the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson contracted COVID-19. A lot of people were very angry at how he had handled the crisis, and so they rejoiced at the fact that he had gotten sick himself. This is a kind of lashing out. It's a kind of seeking payback for the fact that they think that a wrong had been done to him and that he'd acted unjustly. So this is exactly the kind of revenge that the Stoics are talking about. Moreover, notice in this second definition of anger that it involves punishment. We often tend to think that revenge is something separate from punishment. When you follow the appropriate lawful means of justice, then that's not revenge. Whereas when you kind of take matters into your own hands, no, that's revenge. But the Stoics didn't think of it that way. So getting payback through the justice system, or asking that people who had done wrongs to you were punished appropriately, they thought that was a kind of revenge too. So again, it seems like the more general idea is that of payback, not of revenge. So what I really want to emphasize is that when we get angry, it seems that we really do want something bad to happen to the person who wronged us or the person who did an injustice. At the very least, we want them to feel bad for what they did or regret their actions in some important way. And so we could also see that as a kind of emotional punishment. We want them to really understand the wrong that they've done to us, and we want that to hurt. As we've seen, asking whether or not something is in accordance with nature is a really central part of the Stoic ethical strategy. So it's no coincidence that this question arises very early on in Seneca's treatise. And his strategy is really interesting here. He shows that anger is contrary to nature by showing how it's contrary to our deepest impulses as humans. It's how it's contrary to our kind of deepest humanity that we share with each other. Here's what he says. Whether anger is in accord with nature will be evident if we consider the human person closely. What is milder when its mental condition is not warped? What, on the other hand, is crueler than anger? What is more inclined to love others than a human? What is more hostile than anger? The human is born to give and receive assistance, anger to destroy. The one wants to form associations, the other to secede. The one wants to be of benefit, the other to do harm. The one wants to aid even strangers, the other to assault even the nearest and dearest. Human beings are prepared even to sacrifice themselves for the sake of others' advantage. Anger is prepared to plunge into danger, provided it drags the other down. Does anyone, then, show greater ignorance of the nature of things than the person who ascribes this bestial, destructive vice to nature's best and most polished creation? Anger, as I said, is hungry for payback. The presence of this lust in a human being's utterly peaceful breast in no way accords with nature. Human life is constituted by the harmonious exchange of benefits, and is held fast in a pact of mutual assistance, not by fear, but by mutual affection. One of Seneca's primary targets on anger is none other than Aristotle himself. The reason Aristotle features so heavily is that the Aristotelians think that not only is anger beneficial, it's in fact a virtue. Aristotle says that proper anger is one of the virtues which is a mean between excess and deficiency. So his point is that we should feel the right amount of anger at the right time towards the right people in the right degree. So the thought is anger can be controlled, and it's a positive force and an appropriate force in a virtuous person. Importantly, there are also two aspects to Aristotle's defense of anger. Firstly, he thinks that anger is a fitting or an apt response. There's something intrinsically good about feeling the right amount of anger proportionate to the injustice that's been done, and then again feeling it for the right amount of time with respect to the right people. But he also thinks that anger is instrumentally valuable, insofar as it motivates us to fight against injustice, and insofar as it motivates us to fight courageously in battle. So anger is both intrinsically valuable when felt in the right degrees and the right times, and is also instrumentally valuable insofar as it promotes virtuous behavior. So on the Aristotelian account then, it would be a mistake not to get angry when you've been wronged, but it would also be a mistake to get excessively or uncontrollably angry. They want to hit that mean. They want to hit the sweet spot between not enough anger and too much anger. The reason that Seneca rejects the Aristotelian position is because Seneca rejects the fundamental assumption that anger can always be controlled in the way that the Aristotelians are saying that it can be. For the Stoics, there's a very brief moment in which we can control the onset of anger, and after that, it runs away on us, and we're not going to be able to rein it back in. Here's what Seneca says. The best course is to reject straight away the initial prickings of anger, to fight against its first sparks, and to struggle not to succumb to it. Once it has begun to carry us off course, it's difficult to sail back to safety, since not a jot of reason remains once the passion has been let in, and some sovereign right has been granted to it by our own will. It will thereafter do not what you allow, but what it wants. The enemy, I stress this point, must be held at bay on the first frontier. When it has entered and made its way through the gates, it accepts no limits from those it has taken captive. Indeed, the mind is not sequestered, keeping a watch for the passions as things external and apart, so that it can keep them from going farther than they ought. Rather, the mind itself turns into the passion. That is why it cannot summon back its useful, healthy vigor once it has been betrayed and weakened. Reason and passion, as I said, don't have separate and distinct dwelling places, but are the mind's transformation to a better and worse condition. How then will a reason that has been seized and overwhelmed by vices resurrect itself once it has yielded to anger? Or how will it free itself from a murky state in which the admixture of baser elements predominates? This passage reveals a really crucial part of the Stoic theory of emotions, namely that they're corruptions of the mind as a whole. It's not that one part of our mind experiences an impulse that another part of the mind has to suppress. Anger takes over our mind as a whole such that there's no longer anything within it that can fight against its powers. Seneca's view then is that once we assent to an impression that allows us to get angry, it starts to spiral out of control. It corrupts our reasoning in its entirety. And the analogies they use here are really helpful. They say it's like throwing a stone. Once it's been thrown, you can't just grab it in mid-air. It carries it itself by its own momentum. Or it's like when you're running and then suddenly need to stop. You can't just go from a full sprint to a stop. And emotions are like running, whereas rational processes are like a controlled walking. And so this is one of the reasons why they think that you really need to nip the emotions in the bud as soon as they surface, because once you've let them take control, there's no regaining control. Seneca gives a more precise model psychologically of what's going on when we become angry in Book 2. And importantly, it involves 3 stages. So let's see how he describes them. Now, to make plain how passions begin or grow or get carried away, there's the initial involuntary movement, a preparation for the passion, as it were, and a kind of threatening signal. There's a second movement accompanied by an expression of will not stubbornly resolved, to the effect that I should be avenged since I've been harmed, or this man should be punished since he's committed a crime. The third movement's already out of control. It desires vengeance, not if it's appropriate, but come what may, having overthrown reason. We cannot avoid that first mental jolt with reason's help, just as we cannot avoid the other movements that, as I've mentioned, befall our bodies, just as we cannot avoid having another's yawn provoke our own, or avoid closing our eyes at the sudden poke of another's fingers. Reason cannot overcome those movements, though perhaps their force can be lessened if we become used to them and constantly keep a watch for them. That second movement, which is born from deliberation, is eradicated by deliberation. What this passage clarifies is that there are three stages that are involved in becoming angry. The first is something like an involuntary bodily reaction, and elsewhere the Stoics call this a propatheia, or pre-emotion. That's what Seneca means when he's talking about the first scratchings or the first itchings of an emotion that are coming about. The second stage, as we've already seen in the discussion of Stoic epistemology, is the moment of assent. It's when you're presented with an impression that you have been harmed, and there's a movement of the will, or there's a moment where your mind can control whether or not you assent to the impression that you have been harmed, or whether or not you reject that impression. And the Stoics think that this is the crucial moment, because it's the point at which you're in control of your emotions. If you don't assent at that point, the emotion won't continue. On the other hand, if you do assent, that's when the emotion then takes over and spirals out of control. So crucially, there are these three stages to anger. There's the involuntary movement at the start, and the involuntary stage at the end where the emotion gets carried away. But crucially, in the middle, there's this moment where you can assent, where you're in control, and you can decide whether or not you have been harmed, and whether or not it's a good thing for you to get angry. Now, it's beyond doubt that anger is stirred when we have the impression that we've been wronged. The question is whether anger follows directly upon that very appearance, launching its attack without the mind's collaboration, or whether it's stirred with the mind's assent. We hold that anger ventures nothing on its own, but acts only with the mind's approval. For having the impression that one has been done a wrong, desiring to take vengeance for it, and then combining both in the judgment that one ought not to have been harmed and that one ought to be avenged, none of this is proper to a mere impulse set in motion independent of our will. This passage makes really clear what the Stoics actually think. The reason that they think that anger is always within our control is because they think it involves particular judgments that we have to assent to. Nonetheless, they recognize that there are involuntary aspects to our reactions. In the same way that there are bodily impulses that we have when faced with particular appearances, of course there can be particular reflex reactions that we have when we think that we've been wronged. So again, it's crucial to get clear on the fact that the Stoics really do think that emotion is a very specially defined thing that involves these judgments. And insofar as the judgments are in our control, that part of the process is also within our control. But this is why they say, for example, that the wise man will therefore feel some hints and shadows of the passions, but he'll be free from the passions themselves. One of the really crucial parts of Seneca's argument is he thinks that you don't need anger in order to be motivated to act well. Reason can do just the same job, and in fact will do it even better. And their paradigm case here is that of a judge, and I think we share a lot of Seneca's intuitions on this case. Now think through what it means to be a good judge. It would be crazy to say that judges don't care about justice. Of course they do. They've dedicated their lives and careers to fighting for justice. But good judges don't need to be emotional in order to do their job well. And in fact, we'll probably be skeptical of a judge who gets very angry. They lack what people would call judicial temperament. We think that angry judges are more likely to be vindictive or harsh, or to jump to conclusions or make judgments based on stereotypes, not having weighed the evidence fully. But a calm judge can note perfectly well that a law has been violated, recognize that it's wrong, and then assign an appropriate punishment based on the particulars of the case. Calm judges don't need emotions in order to do their job well. And what this shows is that we don't need anger to be motivated to fight against injustice. Reason all by itself, in a calm and reasoned mental state, is able to do just as good a job. In fact, it'll do much better job. So, a good man won't become angry upon seeing an injustice done to those he cares about? No, he will not become angry, but he'll be their champion and defender. Why are you afraid that a proper sense of devotion won't goad him sufficiently, even without anger? The fine and worthy thing is to come forward in defense of one's parents, children, friends, and fellow citizens with one sense of obligation actually leading the way, and to do so willingly, deliberately, and prudently, not impulsively and furiously. One of the really interesting passages in Seneca's treatise on anger is when he really thinks through the Aristotelian position that we should feel anger when we encounter injustices. What he notices then is that if this view is right, that we should become angered when we encounter injustices, the good person would be angry all the time. Because we act badly, and others act badly, and everywhere we turn, there will be some injustice or wrong that's going to be worthy of condemnation. And if each of those acts in turn angered us, Seneca points out our lives wouldn't really be worth living. We'd constantly be fuming, would constantly be getting riled up, would constantly be seeking payback, and then getting enraged at the next thing that we find. So our lives would be constantly characterized by this really troubled mental state. Now, some people think that morality is hard and morality is demanding, and that we should just be angry and indignant at all the injustices that we see. But Seneca takes a different approach. He says, rather than getting angry and enraged at all these injustices, what we should do is forgive everyone, all at once. Nobody really wants a life that's filled with that kind of mental distress and conflict that we have with other people. So we should focus on what we can fix and improve. We should focus on the tasks that we're able to help out with, and not be troubled by the things that we couldn't have impacted anyway. So we shouldn't get overwhelmed with how bad the world is. We should recognize injustices when they're done, and then we should seek to correct them. But we shouldn't get angry at every injustice that we come across. You'll better contemplate this thought. Errors shouldn't make us angry. What if one were to become angry at people unable to put one foot surely after another in the dark? Or at deaf people who don't listen to orders? Or at children because they don't pay attention to their duties but look instead to their age mates' games and silly jokes? What if you should choose to become angry at those who grow sick or old or tired? Among all those other disadvantages that are ours as mortals, there's this: the murkiness of our minds, whence both the inevitability of our mistakes and our fondness for the mistakes we make. To keep from becoming angry with individuals, you must forgive all at once. The human race should be granted a pardon. If you become angry with young men and old men because they do wrong, then be angry with infants. They're going to do wrong. Surely no one becomes angry with children of an age incapable of drawing distinctions, do they? Being human is a greater excuse, and more just than being a child. These are the terms and stipulations of our birth. We are creatures subject to no fewer diseases of mind than of body, neither dull nor slow, to be sure, but misusing our acuity, all of us offering each other examples of vices. When anyone follows those who have gone before, down the wrong route, how could he not have an excuse, since he's gone astray on the common highway? A general strictness is unsheathed against individuals, but pardon is required when the whole army has deserted. What eliminates a wise man's anger? The great crowd of wrongdoers. He understands how unjust it is, and how dangerous to be angry with a vice that is pandemic. Seneca's point then is that we need to take a forgiving attitude towards other people, because we ourselves will inevitably commit mistakes, and others will inevitably commit mistakes against us. And if each of us gets angered at the other, then this is only going to make things worse. So rather, we should seek forgiveness, and we should offer forgiveness freely. Now again, this doesn't mean that we should let people get away with injustice. In another work, on mercy, Seneca clarifies that the attitude that we should take is one of a loving parent towards children. It's not that we let our children get away when they behave badly. We need to take steps in order to improve their characters and in order to improve their behavior. But we don't do that out of anger. We do that out of compassion and out of love. So just because we don't get angry at people and just because we take a forgiving attitude towards them, it doesn't mean we let them get away with anything. We should still correct them. We should still seek to improve other people's characters, and of course we should work to improve our own. But mild and gentle chastisement comes before punishment, and it comes before harshness. And anger is never going to help with that process. So we should take a different attitude entirely. The wise man will not be angry with wrongdoers. Why? Because he knows that the wise man is not born, but made. He knows that very, very few turn out wise in the whole expanse of time. Because he's come to recognize the terms that define human life. And no sane man becomes angry with nature. That would be as pointless as choosing to wonder why fruit doesn't hang on woodland briars or why brambles and thorn bushes aren't filled with some useful fruit. No one becomes angry when nature defends the vice. And so the wise man, calm and even-tempered in the face of error, not an enemy of wrongdoers, but one who sets them straight, leaves his house daily with this thought in mind. I will encounter many people who are devoted to drink, many who are lustful, many who are ungrateful, many who are greedy, many who are driven by the demons of ambition. All such behaviors he will regard as kindly as a doctor does his own patients. When a man's ship is taking on a lot of water, as the joints buckle and gape on every side, he surely doesn't become angry with the sailors and the ship itself, does he? Rather, he runs to help, keeping the water out here, bailing it out there, plugging the gaps he can see, working constantly to counter the unseen gaps that invisibly draw water into the bilge. And he doesn't leave off just because more water takes the place of all the water he drains. Prolonged assistance is needed against constant and prolific evils. Not so they cease, but so they don't gain the upper hand. Once again, Seneca knows how hard it is to follow through the Stoic advice in practice. The Stoics are setting an ideal. It's one that we should aspire to, but we shouldn't be surprised when we fall short. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that the aspiration's not valuable. And Seneca emphasizes that the first goal is not to become angry. But if we fail at that, then the next best thing to do is to cease when we've become angered, so to try to rein our anger back in. And he also recognizes that an important part is trying to help others in stopping them from becoming angry as well. And his treatise is full of all kinds of practical tips that you can apply in your day-to-day lives and that you can apply in the circumstances that you go to. So I would encourage you to read through the rest of the book looking for some of those tips. I just wanted to flag one that was particularly important to me, which is the emphasis on time. The Stoics notice something curious about our emotional responses, namely that they're very time sensitive. So when something first happens that prompts our emotion, it seems really important and it prompts very strong and violent reactions in us. But these reactions, even when the judgments remain, inevitably tend to weaken as time goes on. The Stoics describe this phenomenon in terms of the freshness of an emotion. The emotions that are fresh are stronger and harder to control. And so it's crucial that we rein them in during that time. This is why Seneca says, the great cure for anger is delay. Ask it at the outset, not to forgive, but to deliberate. Its first assaults do the damage, but if it waits, it will back off. Don't try to uproot it all at once. It will be overcome entirely while you pluck at it away, bit by bit. So while it can be hard to just stop anger in its tracks, one thing that we can do is just wait. Take some time to reflect on what's just happened. Don't make any decisions right away. Just stop for a moment and wait for that freshness to fade. Once the freshness has faded, then we have a much better chance at slowly bringing the anger back in, or slowly stopping ourselves from doing something that we'll later regret. No one says to himself, wait a minute. Yet the greatest remedy for anger is postponement, so that its initial ardor might slacken and the darkness that overwhelms the mind might either pass or be less thick. Not a day, but a single hour will mitigate some of the things that are sending you headlong, and others will completely vanish. Even if the adjournment you seek accomplishes nothing, it will now have the appearance of a trial, not a rage. Whenever you want to know the character of a thing, entrust the job to time. No careful discriminations are made in flux. Finally, the last thing I wanted to emphasize is that often in discussions of anger and Stoicism, it's really easy to slip into the mindset that what the Stoics are really doing is telling other people to stop being angry. And I'm not sure that's the right focus. While they clearly care about helping those around us, I think they really pay a lot of attention to the positions that you're in. Are you really the person who should be trying to help this person become less angry? Or should it be left to someone else? If you're in no position to help someone improve, then it's probably best just to stay quiet, all things considered. And ultimately, the Stoic project is one of self-improvement. You should be reading through these texts, not thinking how you're going to help the angry people in your life, but how you can help yourself. So the most important project is one of self-examination. And I think this is really well emphasized in one of my favorite texts from On Anger. The mind must be called to account every day. This was Sextius's practice. When the day was spent and he had retired to his night's rest, he asked his mind, which of your ills did you heal today? Which vice did you resist? In what aspect are you better? Your anger will cease and become more controllable if it knows that every day it must come before a judge. Is there anything finer then than this habit of scrutinizing the entire day? What sort of sleep follows this self-examination? How peaceful, how deep and free when the mind has either praised or admonished, when the sentinel and secret censor of the self has conducted its inquiry into one's character. I exercise this jurisdiction daily and plead my case before myself. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of this habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. For why should I fear any consequence from my mistakes when I'm able to say, see that you don't do it again, but now I forgive you.